Welcome to our Appalachia. My name is Phil Conn, and I'm your host. We're going to discuss a very interesting topic today, and I'm sure it's of interest to all of you because all of us vote one time or another, and we will talk about the political traditions in our area, in the Southern Mountain area. We're fortunate today to have a noted authority on Southern Mountain political traditions, Dr. Gordon McKinney. Dr. McKinney is presently living in Cullowhee, North Carolina. In fact, he's a history professor at Western Carolina University, so he's in an ideal location to really dig right into the political traditions of our Southern Mountain region. Dr. McKinney, welcome to Morehead State University.
Thank you very much, Phil.
Now, it's very interesting to note how Dr. McKinney became fascinated by the political traditions and activities in the Southern Mountains, because you understand Dr. McKinney is a native of New Hampshire. He's a mountaineer, you must understand, because they have mountains in New England, indeed. Right. But Dr. McKinney was at Chicago, Northwestern University. He was doing his doctoral work, and he became very interested in political traditions, voting patterns around the country. So he tells me that as he was looking at a map one day showing different voting patterns, that he noticed a block of counties, of all things, way down in the South. And these folks were voting Republican. They shouldn't be voting Republican because everyone knows that the South is Democratic.
Right.
Okay, so take off from there. Tell us how you came to be interested in Southern Mountain political traditions and what this first peek at the map of voting patterns told you.
I was looking for a dissertation topic because my previous topic had proven not to be a good one. And as you said, I looked at the map. And in the 1936 presidential election, over 1/3 of the Republican counties in the United States were found in the South, and particularly in the mountain counties. The result was I went to my dissertation advisor, and he said, "That's a good topic. Why don't you investigate it?" On starting my topic, I found that the people here, their traditions, were very similar to the region that I grew up in. And I felt immediately at home and comfortable with the topic. And a lot of the stories I began to hear were very similar to the stories that my politician grandfather told me about New Hampshire politics.
Right.
And so I think it was almost a natural for me.
Right.
It was almost like going home again.
Right.
And I have grown more interested and more comfortable with the topic every year. And I've been at it now for about 15 years.
Right.
And it's extremely interesting.
The title of your dissertation was Mountain Republicanism, I understand, and you zeroed in on the period of what?
Between the Civil War
right.
and 1900.
Right. Now, we have already mentioned republicanism in the Southern Mountains, and of course, when we think of the Republican Party, we think of Abraham Lincoln. I guess he's viewed as the founding father of the party one way or another. But tell us, what was the political affiliation, or was there any political affiliation of Southern Mountain people prior to the Civil War? Were they pretty much Democrats like Flatlanders in the South, or was it a mixed bag?
The political system before the Civil War in the South was probably the purest two-party system that we've ever had in this country.
Right.
And the same was true of the mountain counties as well. There were almost equal numbers of Whigs and Democrats, but it depended on the state. Certain states had large percentages of Whigs, and certain states had very large percentages of Democrats. So added together, it was about 50% of each. But depending on the state, you might have an overwhelming number of one party or the other.
Right.
And that trickled down to the county level. Counties might be largely one or the other, but there would be communities within that county that would be of the opposite party.
Right.
So you had pockets of Whig strength and Democratic strength all throughout the Southern Mountains.
But now, as mountain people switched to the new Republican Party, they were both Whigs and Democrats.
That's right.
What gave the greatest impetus to this switchover? Because you're going to tell us that since that time, there's been very little changeover in political affiliation in many mountain counties.
The Civil War was decisive. For many people in the mountains, their life had been contained within their own communities. Their loyalties, their interests, and so on were locally oriented. The Civil War comes, and the North is to the north of them, and the Confederacy is to the south of them, and they're caught in the middle. They can't escape the war. Armies march through their communities. People in the communities have young men in the Army. The people in the communities start fighting each other. The Civil War was truly a civil war in the Southern Mountains. People in the same community fighting and killing each other. The result is that the people in the mountains were probably more deeply affected by the American Civil War than any other event in American history, and probably more affected than any other group in the United States. And they made political decisions that would make them Democrats or Republicans after the war, during the war. And this event was so overwhelming that they kept those political loyalties long after the original reason for taking them had left.
Did the people in the Southern Mountains also support Abraham Lincoln per se? Did Abraham Lincoln receive a big vote in the Southern Mountains?
No. When he first ran in 1860, out of approximately 130,000 votes in the Southern Mountains, Abraham Lincoln got 2,000.
I see. So the Republican Party didn't really take hold during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln.
No.
It was rather after he was assassinated.
Although in West Virginia and in eastern Kentucky, they did hold elections in 1864, and a lot of mountain people did vote for Lincoln. But Lincoln was running as a Union candidate for president that year, not as a Republican candidate.
Right.
And the vice presidential nominee was Andrew Johnson from East Tennessee.
Right.
And I think it could be argued that a lot of people voted for the Union and for Andrew Johnson rather than for Abraham Lincoln.
And Johnson was a Democrat, I understand.
That's right. Johnson was a mountain Democrat.
I see. So they weren't really voting Republican when they voted for Lincoln at that point in time.
That's right.
Well, a lot of folks have suggested that during the time of the Civil War in the Southern Mountains, that being a Unionist, being for the cause of the North, and being a Republican were pretty much one and the same. This would not have necessarily been true in the Southern Mountains. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think it is fair to say that every Republican was probably a Unionist. But it is not correct to say that every Unionist became a Republican.
Was the Democratic Party then at the time of the Civil War perceived as the party of the South and the party of rebellion?
Yes.
In other words, the Democratic Party all but died out for a time north of the Mason-Dixon line?
It didn't die out, but it became a party identified with the South, and therefore a minority and an unsuccessful party in the North. And it took 15 years or so after the war before the Democratic Party really recovered from that.
Now, when we speak of Union sentiment, and you hear a lot of talk of this, Union sentiment in the South, and specifically in the Southern Mountains, it's understandable to me how border states, certainly eastern Kentucky and the western part of Virginia, and indeed West Virginia was formed over this issue, but I understand how the proximity to the North would tend to make some identification with the Northern cause. But I am told that there were Union supporters who ultimately became Republicans all the way to the southern extremes of the Appalachian Mountains, meaning in North Georgia, in the very southern portions of southeast Tennessee and southwestern North Carolina. Is this correct?
Yes, this is correct.
Okay, were there actually volunteers for the Union Army as far south as the mountains of North Georgia?
Yes, I'm most familiar with North Carolina, and the other day I came across a document written by a woman who lived on the South Carolina border, extreme southern end of North Carolina, and she and her mother and 14 children walked 150 miles across the mountains, not using roads because they would have been picked up by the Confederate Army, but in the mountains, to escape to the Federal Army in Knoxville. because her husband was serving in the Federal Army and her neighbors were picking on her.
I see. And she was a South Carolinian or North Carolinian, right on the border, very far south.
And she walked. It took her 4 or 5 weeks to walk across the mountains, and she talks about how they nearly starved to death and they nearly drowned in several rivers and things like this. So that people were tremendously committed to the Union cause, really quite deep in the Confederacy.
Well, let me ask you, was support for the Union cause in the Southern Mountains based on genuine rapport with the North, an understanding of the North, or was it based just on the philosophical notion that the Union should be preserved, or was there already animosity between mountain counties and flatland counties? For example, in Kentucky, did the people of the mountains in eastern Kentucky resent or have strained relations with the gentry of the bluegrass before the Civil War?
The last factor, the animosity between mountain people and flatlanders, was very real and is the primary cause of this unionism. But I think it's important also to note that in the United States before the Civil War, there was a strong feeling of nationalism, which many people who joined the Confederacy also felt. I've read the letters of people who joined the Confederacy, joined it voluntarily and with a certain amount of eagerness, and they always say, "I'm very sorry to leave the United States."
They felt it was almost anti-patriotic, but at the same time they felt some sense of patriotism toward the South.
That's right.
There was really a choice between two loyalties.
That is correct. And the situation in the mountains was that the loyalty to the Union was not counterbalanced by the privileges that the flatlanders had.
Right.
And so the people in the mountains were able to, in a sense, indulge themselves in their patriotic feeling toward the nation and as a whole, which the flatlanders did not.
Right. Well, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about the issue of slavery as relates to the Civil War. And I assume that there weren't many slaveholders or as many slaveholders in the mountains. So certainly mountaineers were not inclined to defend the rights of flatlanders to own slaves. But now this issue is probably misunderstood. Would it be correct to say that mountaineers who did not own slaves were abolitionists, or did they just not want to get involved in the plantation owners' war?
There's no question but that mountain people did not like slavery, but they didn't like slaves either. We're close enough here to Berea to simply recall the early history of Berea. It was set up to be a biracial institution before the Civil War. And the hostility directed toward Berea came not only from the bluegrass, but it came from the mountains as well. Slavery in the mountains existed. There weren't very many slaves. There weren't very many slave owners, but something that needs to be remembered is that slave owners represented a very small percentage of total Southern white society anyway. That even in the bluegrass area, only a very small number of people owned slaves. But the problem was that if you free the slaves, all white people would then be in economic competition with black people. Now that was something that held the white community together. In the mountains, there were so few blacks that the direct economic competition would not be great. And so mountain people who were hostile to black people.
Just as outsiders, just as people they didn't understand and trust.
Well, and they shared a universal American racial animosity.
I see.
One of the most striking things about the Civil War period, slightly after the war, is when the national government is forcing southern states to allow black people to vote. There are a series of referendums in Iowa and Illinois and Connecticut where they allow all of the people of those states to vote on whether blacks will be allowed to vote, and overwhelmingly they vote not to allow black people to vote in Iowa and Illinois. And so the feeling towards blacks was a universal feeling the thing that distinguished various parts of the country were how many black people were actually physically there.
Right.
And what distinguished the mountain areas was the fact that there were relatively few black people in the mountains.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get past the Civil War for a moment. Let's get into Reconstruction, because we are going to have to move along if we're going to get to the 20th century. But during Reconstruction, inasmuch as the Southern Mountain folks supported the Union in many areas, certainly as much as they supported the Confederacy,
yes,
was there any distinction made on the part of the federal government during Reconstruction in mountain areas, or all of a sudden were Southern mountaineers Southerners along with other parts of the South?
It depends on the state. In Tennessee, for example, what they did was they supported a government of mountaineers to take over in Tennessee.
I see. So East Tennessee began to predominate Tennessee politics.
That's right.
This was in lieu of kind of a carpetbagger arrangement in other areas.
That's exactly right. The
Okay.
people who ran Tennessee, for the most part, were native Tennesseans, but mountain Tennesseans.
So they did benefit temporarily,
yes,
in view of their Union support.
that's
Okay.
correct.
And East Tennesseans were predominantly Republican at that point in time, and are to this day, I suppose.
Yes, yes. It's the most strongly Republican part of the United States.
Right. Now, people don't really realize that. A lot of people don't.
No.
But you told me earlier that the two congressional districts in East Tennessee have voted Republican predominantly and consistently more than almost any other congressional districts.
That's correct.
Right.
And one of them last voted for a Democrat 150 years ago.
Right, right. So the whole notion of the solid Democrat South just isn't true when you talk about Southern mountains. It's quite the contrary.
Yes, it is quite the contrary. On the other hand, the view that the Southern mountains are a solid Republican area is
Right.
not true either.
Right. Well, for example, the two congressional districts in eastern Kentucky are the 7th and the 5th. And the 7th generally goes Democratic, whereas the 5th is pretty strong Republican, as strong a Republican congressional district as we have.
Yeah.
And of course, this is the far southeastern part of the state and the south central part of the state, but it is Appalachian Kentucky almost in toto.
Right.
Let me ask you now, as we talk about the shift in voting patterns, shortly after the Civil War then, Republicans began to be elected to congressional seats, to local offices in southern mountain counties and congressional districts. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Was this change almost total and overnight, or was it a slow erosion from Democratic and Whig voting patterns?
It was overnight, totally overnight.
Right.
As soon as the war ended, the party system was there intact.
Now here again, though, do you view that as kind of a feeling of rapport with the national capital, or was this more again strain with the State House and a desire to vote different or to be different?
It's a combination of two things. First of all, it was partially imposed. Kentucky and West Virginia were not under the Reconstruction plans, but southwestern Virginia, East Tennessee, and western North Carolina were. And the federal government imposed the Republican Party on these states in one form or another.
Right.
So that the decision was either you do join the party or you don't. And the party was just created. Now in West Virginia and in eastern Kentucky, the party evolved out of the Unionist coalition, and there's a little bit more of a natural growth there. But in addition to the federal influence, there is still that very strong feeling on the part of the mountain regions that they are being discriminated against.
Right.
East Tennessee, twice during Reconstruction, attempted to create a separate state of East Tennessee. And they did not do it either time. But I think it shows the depth of their alienation from the rest of the state.
A tremendous strain.
Tremendous strain.
Right. Now, when you talk about county politics, you, of course, are talking about everything from the school board to the courthouse group, and these folks became Republican as well, I take it.
Yes.
I'm reminded of Jackson County, Kentucky, which has a high percentage vote for the Republican Party to this day. It amazes me that for 100 years, we're talking about from the time of Reconstruction to today, many counties have continued to vote Republican. If you even suggested in Jackson County that they were Unionist, that indeed their forefathers fought in the battle for Chattanooga, you know, the battle above the clouds, they'd probably punch you out. I guess in Jackson County, Kentucky, you have as many of these license plates, bumper stickers that say, you know, get your heart into Dixie or get your fanny out of our county, as anywhere going. They don't really identify their republicanism with a historical unionism. They, of course, may feel some antipathy toward the bluegrass, I don't know. But explain to me why, for 100 years, these mountain counties have continued to be Republican, and it hasn't necessarily been based on any political philosophy.
Right.
It hasn't been based on any keen sense of history in some cases. Why this tradition for sticking with a party in the mountains?
The Republican Party became part of local tradition. It became part of a family tradition. It became part of a small community tradition. It became divorced from its historical roots. One of the things that always strikes me when I go through Sevier County, Tennessee, as I did driving over, you stop in Sevierville or some of the small towns, you see evidences of Confederate artifacts all over the place. In the vote, whether to join the Confederacy or not, Sevier County voted 1,301 to stay in the Union and 1 to join the Confederacy. And either that one person has reproduced all of the people in Sevier County, or the people have forgotten that particular heritage, which I think is obviously the case. Now, what had happened was that as you got into the 1890s, racial considerations became dominant in Southern politics.
Jim Crow found the Southern mountains.
Jim Crow didn't need to. This is one of the more recent discoveries. That Jim Crow was there, he just wasn't legal.
I see.
And what you have in the 1890s is the legalization of a system that is already there.
Okay, but it was heartfelt for mountaineers
Yes.
as surely as flatlanders.
Yes, absolutely. And as racial considerations became important, the identification with the Union, which was also identification with the North in some respect, became unacceptable.
Right. And now Southern mountaineers view themselves as rebels in terms of tracing it back.
That's right.
Far more than Unionists. And a lot of people would contend that just because of its isolation, that the Southern mountains have persisted in a lot of conservative attitudes that would have to do with equality more than flatlanders. I don't necessarily buy that. I think there's still a strong sense of independence and kind of an egalitarian ethic in the mountains. But it is interesting to see how Southern mountain people discovered the Confederacy and came to view it as their roots years after the fact, and in many cases erroneously.
Yes, but this is typical. We have pretty good evidence now that the majority of Southerners opposed the coming of the Confederacy. Not just people in the mountains, but a majority of all Southerners. Georgia and Louisiana probably voted to stay in the Union, not to leave the Union. But once the war began and Sherman marched through Georgia,
the die was cast.
That was all over.
And what hostilities didn't exist were created very promptly,
yes.
I dare say. Right.
Yes.
Right.
So that the initial allegiance to the Union and even the allegiance through the war could be changed by later historical circumstances.
Well, of course, they say blood runs thicker than water, and I guess regionalism runs thicker than nationalism if you get right down to it.
Well, especially when it's mixed with a highly motivating issue. And the racial issue in American politics has been highly motivating.
Right. We don't have a lot more time. I want to mention your book. You have written an outstanding book, and the title is Southern Mountain Republicans. This deals with the period 1865, or about the time of the Civil War, to 1900, and the subtitle is Politics of the Appalachian Community. This, I guess, grew out of your dissertation,
yes.
But I find it to be one of the best contributions to the history and traditions of Southern mountain politics available today. I hope that some of our viewers will take a chance to read this book. It's an outstanding book. Let me ask you one or two questions that I'd hope to get into heavily about mountain politics as it exists today. A lot of stereotypes on mountain politics, about county bosses, about the buying of votes, things of this type. Now, why does it matter so much in the mountains to win an election or to lose an election? Why is it a matter of life and death? Why is it a matter of buying votes, breaking the law, if indeed that is true?
First of all, it is true in some areas. One of the problems for people who deal with Southern Mountain people is not the existence of things like this, but that everybody gets tarred with the same brush. I lived in Chicago, as you indicated, for a while, and anybody familiar with Mayor Daley's operations know that corruption in politics can be found anywhere in the United States. But the Southern Mountain people have gotten a reputation for having violent and corrupt politics. Now, the reason that this has an impact on local politics is that the county is still a very important political unit in Kentucky, as it has been since the Constitution of 1891. And it's important to win county elections in Kentucky, very important. It determines who works for the school system. It determines who gets local jobs. It may even determine who gets a job in a private business. And people take it seriously because it affects their lives.
Right. It has to do with life and employment.
That's exactly right. In many parts of the United States, local elections are very meaningless.
Right.
But here they count.
Right. And you can expect people to react with an appropriate amount of passion in view of that fact.
Yes, and then also, quite often local politics involve families.
Right.
And you get involved because your cousin is running.
Right.
Or a family that you haven't liked for a long time is running against.
Right.
Something like this. So that there's a lot of personal element involved here, too.
I regret we're going to have to wrap it up. We have far more to say, but we don't have time to say it. So I want to thank Dr. Gordon McKinney for being with us, and I want to tell our audience to join us again as we have another discussion of our mountain heritage and culture. Thank you very much, Dr. McKinney.
Thank you, Phil.